All right, we are going to talk today real quick about biochemistry. We're going to start a unit, and essentially what that means is we're going to look at the chemistry of living things. So what are the chemicals, what are the molecules, the main things that make up who we are? So our definition that we're going to write for biochemistry is, we always start with the study of, and then we're going to say chemical substances in living things. Okay, and hopefully that would be easier to remember, right? Bio means life. So again, we're talking about the chemistry of life. Okay? Now, before we get into the common elements, and the one we're going to talk most about is carbon, let's do a quick review of what hopefully we should already know. When we talk about chemicals, when we talked about atoms are made of three different parts. Okay, they have protons, neutrons, and electrons. So protons, hopefully you remember that protons are found in the inside of an atom, what we call the nucleus. They're found in the nucleus, and they also have a positive charge. Okay, protons positive, P and P. Neutrons are also found in the nucleus of an atom. Neutrons have a neutral charge, or we could say it has zero charge. Okay, and electrons are the only ones that are found in a different place than the nucleus, and those are found outside of the nucleus in things we call electron rings. Okay, so we're going to say they're found, let's just say orbiting. Okay, which means around the nucleus. Okay, and electrons have a negative charge. Okay, hopefully you remember that. That's going to be important to remember when we talk about bonding and why different atoms and elements want to essentially stick together. Okay, so really quickly, let's talk about the difference between covalent and ionic bonding. And again, this hopefully should be a review. Okay, covalent bond happens when atoms share electrons. Okay, they're going to share electrons, and we'll talk about why in just a second. And ionic bonds are when a positive and negative atom are attracted. Wow, attracted. Okay. All right, so we have covalent bond, we have ionic bond, and we do also have something called a hydrogen bond, but we're not going to specifically talk about that during this unit. The other big thing we need to remember is this idea of valence electrons. Okay, so let's just draw a little picture here. You told me, or we just talked about an atom, okay, has a nucleus, and in the nucleus we have protons and we have neutrons. Okay, and then around that nucleus we have electrons. We have different energy levels. So the first energy level, closest to the nucleus, can have up to 2 electrons in it. Okay, and then that is considered full. The next level, okay, can have up to 8 electrons in order to be full. So let's draw that in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 electrons, okay, and so on. The next levels, let's just say it for our purposes, they can have 8 as well. Now, the idea behind a valence electron is that valence electrons are the outermost electrons. So they're the ones that are furthest away from the nucleus. Okay, so in this example, let's just add a couple more electrons on the outside. Let's say it has 3 valence electrons in this example. Okay, because you can see it has 1, 2, 3 on the electron ring that's furthest from the nucleus. Okay? Now the idea here is that in order to feel strong, in order to feel secure, it wants to have a full outer layer. It wants to have a full layer in its outermost shell. So for this example, that would be it either wants to gain 5 more electrons to have 8 total in the outside of it, right? Or the other thing it can do is it can get rid of these 3. It can subtract the 3 electrons that it has, 1, 2, 3, and give them away to other elements that might want them. So that's probably what it's going to do, because it's going to be easier to get rid of 3 than gain 5. Okay? That's going to become important when we talk about some of these main elements that compose living things. Okay? All right, so let's skip over here real quick. I'm going to give you some of the most common elements that we would find in living things. The first one is carbon. Carbon is going to be very, very important. Okay, and we're going to talk about carbon over here in just a second. The second one is hydrogen. Hydrogen is found in a lot of the compounds that we're going to talk about. It's also found in water, right? And we've talked about how common water is in our body. It's 70 to 80% of us, so that makes sense that we're going to have a lot of hydrogen. Oxygen is one of the main elements. Phosphorus is a main element, and phosphorus is found in a compound called ATP. I want you to write that down because that's also going to be a compound that we're going to talk a lot about. And the last one is nitrogen. Okay, those are the common elements that make up living things in the compounds that we're going to look at this unit. Okay, last thing we're going to do today is look at carbon and why carbon is so important to living things. So the first thing that we need to know is down here. Okay, we have a little figure of carbon, and this is essentially what carbon would look like. All right, it's got a nucleus. That's where the protons plus the neutrons are found. Okay, what we're most concerned with in this example is the electrons, because that's going to determine how it bonds. Okay, whether it wants to share electrons to get a full layer, or whether it's going to give away some, etc. So what can you tell me about the first electron ring of carbon? How many electrons does it have? Okay, and I would say if this is that first ring, you'll notice there's 1 and there's 2. So that would be considered a full first ring. Okay. The second energy level, right here, how many electrons do you notice that it has? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, now here is where it gets interesting. Carbon has 4 valence electrons. Okay, it's the second ring, so how many does it want? If you remember back to what I said before, it wants to have 8 total. It wants 8. Okay, so because of that, carbon is going to bond. It's going to share the outermost electrons with other elements, and it's going to bond a lot. Okay, and so because of that, it has an ability to produce these really large complex compounds. So let's write some of that down that we just said. Number 1, we said that carbon has how many valence electrons? Has 4 valence electrons. Okay, it wants how many? How many does it need in order to feel full on the outer layer? It wants 8 valence electrons. Okay, so now in order for carbon to have a full outer layer of electrons, what's it going to have to do? What would we just say? It's going to steal some from another element, right? or in most cases, it's going to share with other elements. And what happens when we share, just like we set up here, okay, is it creates a bond. Okay, and that sharing creates bonds. Okay, those bonds then can allow carbon to create really large, complex compounds. So creates bonds, and I'm going to put and allows carbon to create large, complex compounds. And that essentially is why we can be so specialized, okay, because we can have some of those larger compounds that carbon allows us to make. We also use some carbon compounds in everyday life. Some of them you might be familiar with, some of them you may not be, but carbon is one of those elements that's found in almost everything that you can think of, okay? The graphite in your pencils is made of carbon, okay? The butane that you use for maybe a gas grill, okay? That is made of carbon. Alcohol. Rubbing alcohol, that's made of carbon. Methane, which is an energy source, that's made of carbon. So we see that in a lot of places in our everyday lives, that carbon is super important. So the next time we come back, we're going to look at a little bit more specifically the compounds that we use, and we see carbon being used in. But again, the main points here is the idea that carbon is really important. It allows us to make large compounds. It allows us to go through chemical processes in our body and to be much more advanced than other types of things.